Hello everyone, welcome back. Country risk seems on the front page of newspapers all around the world. There's been a spectacular increase in country risk in 2017. Think of Turkey, Venezuela, of course, Philippines, debt crisis, terrorism, political upheaval, exchange rate depreciation, you name it. But what does one mean actually with country risk? Well, a traditional definition of country risk has to do with cross-border investment. You have an investor or a banker who decides to hold claims and assets in a foreign country. Risk then stems from the ability, but also the willingness of the country to pay you back in full and on time. So you have a combination of economic, financial, and socio-political risk. This is a traditional definition which in fact must be revised sharply. In fact, country risk is not the monopoly of foreign investors. After all, Donald Trump in the White House does create uncertainty and risk for US companies which export in Mexico, for banks, for households, and for the man of the street. And what about Maduro in Venezuela, and Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and Duterte in the Philippines? And you can have large risks that are not financial, such as legal and regulatory or reputation risk. So country risk can affect both domestic and international economic agents, and it must be tackled taking into account the country's specific situation in the globalized system. Indeed, any country, including the US or Spain or France, can be contaminated by the spillover effect of regional and global crises. Globalization has become an echo chamber. Think of global terrorism, of higher interest rates, or the volatility of the US dollar, or fluctuating commodity prices, or also downgrading by rating agencies. All this volatility will have feedback effect on specific countries. So the issue is not eliminating risk, but to spot it, to measure it, and to mitigate it. Insurance companies such as Aon or COFAS attempt to map out country risk to facilitate identifying risky spots or the spread of violence in specific regions. That's fine, but that does not tell you much regarding where risk will come from. What are the opportunities, even in risky countries, and what to do to mitigate risk. This sort of country risk maps can be useful early warning signals of regional risk contamination and contagion. What makes country risk a fascinating topic to study and to manage is this combination of country and risk. So we need to assess what makes a country volatile, looking at its history, its values, its culture, its institutions, its political system, and its macroeconomic framework. And assessing the quality of governance, including corruption, will be at the heart of the analysis in this seminar. First of all, the country risk analyst and the manager will focus on the specific risk dimensions of a given country. He or she will tackle the macroeconomic risk, including inflation, investment, unemployment, productivity, and economic growth. Then the country's monetary policy, including exchange rates and interest rates. He or she will measure, as we shall see in the seminar, the nominal and the real effective exchange rate in order to assess the competitiveness of the country. When all this is done, the country risk analyst has done half of the job. The analysis will shift now to the risk elements that come from the globalized economy. Rating agencies, terrorism, global growth, trade, and so on. When most of the risk elements have been analyzed, the time comes from cross-country comparison. You might have a country with low risk, but with a very low market potential, or a high-risk country, think of China, that you cannot afford to keep outside your business strategy. So everything is a matter of combining risk and opportunities. Now keep in mind that this risk map of A.T. Kearney is just a snapshot at a specific time. Then you need to make it in 3D by projecting the impact of time in the future. All what we have seen so far means that it's highly difficult and indeed risky to make long-term projections for the future of a country's socio-economic development. Remember that back in 1945, Ghana and Korea had exactly the same GDP per capita. Productivity, capital market access, demography will be of crucial importance in boosting or slowing down the pace of change and modernization. Country risk as a whole is based on a number, let's say half a dozen, underlying risk elements. Let's look at these elements. Sovereign risk, for example, is linked to capital controls, debt default, insolvency in the banking system. Political risk can stem from political turmoil, corruption, strikes, revolution, war. Systemic risks come from the outside, from the global economy, regional recession, competitive devaluations, commodity price fluctuations. Legal, regulatory risk will stem from contract repudiation, bureaucracy, the change of the rules, volatile legal and regulatory framework. Socio-cultural risk, think of Iran or Turkmenistan, can come from cultural and religious intolerance. Exchange rate risk will stem from exchange rate imbalances, sharply overvalued exchange rate, imported inflation, deteriorating competitiveness of an overvalued exchange rate. And macroeconomic risk, probably the larger, will stem from inflation, stop and go, stock market bubble, rising wages, and slowing down productivity. All these elements, these 6 or 7 elements, underline the country risk complexity of any given country. Now, all these elements can be quantified, at least for the first 4: economic risk, financial and transfer risk, exchange risk, and commodity fluctuation risk. They can be quantified with indicators or econometric models. Now, soft risk, such as political risk, cultural risk, operational risk, legal and contractual, as well as regional and systemic risk, cannot be quantified. They are subjective, judgmental, but they can be diversifiable with insurance and guarantees. Now, risk, in fact, has to do with exposure. And we must, in fact, understand that there are half a dozen risk exposures which make country risk specific for economic agents. The exporter, for example, will face capital controls, exchange rate devaluation, or bribes in the customs agencies. The importer will face the risk of defective supplies or exchange rate overvaluation. He will pay more for the same amount of goods. Investment fund managers will face drop in commodity prices, competitive devaluations, or debt default, or worse, a stock market crisis and a stock market bubble. M&A's managers will also face a devaluation of the exchange rate, bad governance, corruption, and a weak productivity, as well as, of course, nationalization of the assets in the foreign country. FDI, industrial groups and multinationals will face the risk of capital controls. They cannot bring their money back home, or contract repudiation, or deficient infrastructures. They cannot bring the goods and services in the airport or in the port. Finally, creditors will face payment arrears or debt default and write-off. Let us not forget domestic economic agents, which, like you and me, will also face the risk of inflation, banking crisis, negative interest rates, protectionism, and political turmoil in their own country. Country risk is not the monopoly of foreign investors and multinationals. It also affects domestic economic agents. So to wrap up, everything boils down to the quality of information and of economic intelligence. This is a best risk mitigation strategy. There is a large, very large number of data sources coming from private and public agencies. They can be broken down in two main categories, public and private, and public sources can be broken down into bilateral, which means country, and multilateral agencies, mainly the IMF, the World Bank, and the BIS. We shall use a number of methods and analyses to tackle the fascinating but complex and changing nature of country risk. And that will help you keeping ahead of the game and not to be caught off guard by an abrupt devaluation, a revolution, or a war. Stay tuned.